This idea is possibly like the aliens living in the wormhole in Star Trek Deep Space. Excuse me, living in the wormhole in Star Trek Deep Space Nine, who Captain Sisko tried to explain linear time to, because they existed in this same state of perceiving all time, past, present, and future at the same moment. They perceived it all at the same time. And the metaphor that Captain Sisko used to explain this time was baseball. Baseball as a metaphor. As he said, it all comes down to each pitch. And, the pitcher throws the ball and you have no idea what's going to happen. You could hit the ball. You could swing and miss. You could hit it to any number of plays. A million different things could happen with each throw of the ball. And that is how we kind of perceive linear time, that it's the unpredictability. And the aliens, of course, were like, correct. So you relish your ignorance then. As opposed to, again, when you view all time as a cohesive whole, you're like, it's irrelevant. Those differences are irrelevant.
Right.
Because it's all happened before and it'll all happen again. You know what I mean? Like, it's irrelevant, the differences right now, because it's all happened before. A million pitches have been thrown before, and a million things have already happened. And so it's already happened. These things have all happened before.
Aggressive. Adversarial.
Competition. For fun. It's a game that Jake and I play on the holodeck. It's called baseball.
Baseball? What is this?
I was afraid you'd ask that. I throw this ball to you, and this other player stands between us with a bat, a stick, and he tries to hit the ball in between these two white lines. The rules aren't important. What's important is it's linear. Every time I throw this ball, 100 different things can happen in a game. He might swing and miss. He might hit it. The point is, you never know. You try to anticipate. Set a strategy for all the possibilities as best you can. But in the end, it comes down to throwing one pitch after another and seeing what happens. With each new consequence, the game begins to take shape.
And you have no idea what that shape is until it is completed.
That's right.
Let us take a journey back into time.
Completely unbalanced.
Come on now, Brian.
That's pretty awful.
Oh my God.
He's unbalanced.
This guy is a lunatic.
These men lived in a much different time. God, we got some kooky people back in this time.
It's not obvious that we are professionals. You're not paying attention. We know what we're doing.
But I'm serious.
Can we start already?
Hello and welcome, Unbalanced listeners. This is Unbalanced Views of History, a mostly American history podcast. I'm Brian, a history nerd who stopped wearing a watch because I refuse to be bound by time. In each Unbalanced episode, I read a fascinating and usually little-known story from history to my friend, a man who recently found himself so terrified of a balloon that he had flashbacks to the time a clown was mean to him at a birthday party. It's Mike. Mike, how's it going, buddy?
What's going on, my man? And clowns are very, very scary. So
I agree.
I'm not the only one who's scared of clowns.
But balloons aren't scary.
Balloons, not necessarily. The big, gigantic, scary Chinese ones are scary, though. Those are scary.
When that story first broke, I said, wait, it's a Chinese spy balloon? I was like, everybody understands that they have satellites, right? Like, everybody understands that balloon can't gather much more than like Google Earth does right now. Everybody understands that, right? I was like, surely this isn't going to be a thing where everybody loses their mind. And then, of course, everybody loses their mind. I'm like, they make all our electronics. You don't think they have satellites that can see like what's on your phone from space? Come on. What is wrong with you? What do you? I'm like, and so their grandmaster plan is to send like a thing you can see, like spot. Come on, come on. I was like, at best they're doing this just to fuck with everybody. And if they did it for that reason, hey, bravo, bravo. Job well done. I mean, like, if the goal was to make everybody freak out, then job well done. But usually it seems to me that balloons are used for weather. So I saw that story. I was just like, this is silly. This is going to end silly. And then shooting it down was also silly. Like, what are you doing? Like, what are you? It's just, all of it is very silly. It's just the idea that we are not 24/7 spying on them in the exact same way. Is just, I mean, the whole thing's ridiculous. You know what I mean? The whole thing's ridiculous. It's like, oh, come on.
I do find it to be silly. Odd. Odd would be the best word I could use to describe it. I thought it was very odd. I mean, espionage and all. We're constantly, every country's doing it to one another all the time. I just found it odd that this big giant balloon was floating through the sky.
Yeah, across the sky.
Where'd they launch it from? And
it came across Montana, so I mean, presumably it came across the Pacific. I mean, that's so I mean, presumably they launched it from China, and it floated across the Pacific.
Huh.
But again, I mean, we put balloons up all the time. We've had a couple of incidents where we've had balloons go into other countries' airspace because we have weather balloons and that's what China said. It's a weather balloon, and I don't entirely believe that. I mean, I don't believe that our weather balloons are weather balloons. They're weather balloons. They're probably gathering atmospheric data in order to have plausible deniability, but that's not all they do.
Sure.
But I mean, I just think it's funny that it's like, oh no, China's spying on us. I'm like, have you been
news?
have you been on TikTok? Have you?
You have the TikTok.
But also,
this is someone who just posted something on TikTok too, probably.
Well, and it's like, have you been on Amazon or Facebook or like? So my wife was looking at. She searched for cruises online. She just did a cruise search, and all of a sudden we're getting, like, literally within 2 days we've got we've got flyers in the mail. We've got like flyers in the mail from cruise companies.
Yep.
And it's like, yeah, that's probably coincidental.
Yeah, sure.
I mean, it's just like, it's also silly. It's just like whatever data is being collected is already, like, whatever data they're collecting, trying to collect secretly with a balloon is already available for sale from Meta and Amazon and Instagram, and like, they're all set. That's what they do.
Yes.
It's all very, very silly.
Yes, I agree.
I thought the whole thing was so over. I did get a kick out of it this week. Anyway, that all said, considering that our current episode is about clock time and time money connections, I found something I thought was interesting and relevant. I don't know if you use Chrome, the Chrome browser.
Yes.
I found that there is a Chrome extension called Time Well Spent.
Oh.
Time Well Spent determines how many hours you need to work to purchase various items that you might want. So you punch in your salary.
Yes.
So again, you give them your salary information, and then they will like look at a wide range of products that you might be interested in. They're like, oh, this will cost you 7 hours or 27 hours or 5. Yeah. So there you go. People are completely captured by time.
Yes.
Now, go ahead.
That was kind of a sort of from, I don't know if you read Rich Dad Poor Dad.
Yeah, I know the book. I read the book a long time ago. I was not impressed by it at the time. I'm less impressed by the guy now.
Yeah. I mean, I wasn't a big fan of the book. I read it, but in there, it did have, I believe it was that book. It had a lesson where dad was talking to his son. Son was saying, or poor dad was saying, son, we can't afford that, blah, blah, blah. Rich dad would say, son, this is how you would afford it. We got to figure out how to afford it. How much do you have to do? How much do you have to work to be able to get whatever that is? So it was a different mindset. That kind of reminded me of that.
Yeah, I can see that. I'm not gonna. I would say a grim mindset, but yes, you are correct. Of course. So on the flip side of all this, the oligarchs that run our world met at Davos a couple weeks ago, and I don't know if you saw any of this, but like there was a whole bunch of hand wringing about how to solve the quiet quitting phenomenon.
Ooh.
So I kind of liked this. I saw a bit of this, and I thought, this kind of suggests that maybe workers are starting to wrench a bit of time control back from their bosses.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. But, I don't know, just a couple of things that since we did the first part of this story, I saw in the news and I thought about, I was like, oh yeah, this is kind of relevant to what we're talking about. Anyway.
Nice. Lay it on me. I'd like to hear it.
That was it. They were just, just some people, the quiet quitting, the quiet quitting thing, right? Working, working the bare minimum so that you don't get fired, but not doing anything extra. So,
that's not a new thing. That's not a new thing.
No, but I think it's but I think it's a bit of a phenomenon because we've been sort of stuck in a push towards ever increasing efficiency without a corresponding increase in wages. And I think so. Quiet quitting, I think, is a bit of a rebellion against that stuff. Like, no, I'm not going to take on any extra work. I'm going to do the bare minimum, and that's the way. But I think it's more like that there are more people doing it, or at least there's a fear that they are. Again, it's always been happening. I'm not sure. I don't know but they were talking about it at Davos. So it was a big thing, and like they were trying to figure out ways to end it. And one of the big solutions that came out was your grandparents are going to have to go back to work, whether they like it or not. That's basically what it boils down to. They want the retired to come out of retirement and start picking up some jobs, and and then they want children to work. That's the other thing. So
yeah.
I mean, they just passed that law in Iowa that 14-year-olds now are going to be allowed to work in meat packing plants. So that's cool. So the next time you get ground beef, you're likely to get a 14-year-old's finger.
Nice.
Some cool stuff. Yeah, it's good to put children in charge of dangerous machinery. I think that's.
I don't think that they would be putting children in charge.
No. That's what the law was. It was to allow them to work with the dangerous machines that they have been barred from doing because it's not safe. The law literally was to allow children to work with more dangerous with the dangerous equipment that safety regulations have barred them from doing because of child labor laws. That is the literal law that just passed in Iowa. Yeah.
Well, I'd like to see what dangerous equipment and dangerous jobs they're letting these kids perform. But
I mean, all heavy equipment is dangerous. I mean, that's the thing. That's why, I know when I was a kid and I worked in restaurants, like when I was in high school and I worked at a pizza place, I wasn't allowed to use the gigantic dough mixer where we mixed like 20 pounds of pizza dough at a time. Because the dough hook could rip an adult human like just to shreds. Because the dough hook was like the size of my adult torso, and weighed like 40 pounds, and is being spun around on this humongous mixer. And that was just like at a mall pizza joint. And so we weren't allowed to. People weren't allowed to do that until they were 16. You were allowed to use I think at 16 you could use the dough mixer, but you couldn't, like the 14 and 15-year-olds that worked, with work permits and stuff, were not allowed to touch it.
Right.
But at 16 you could use the dough mixer. I think it might have even been 18, but I think it was 16. Anyway, I don't know. At some point I had to make pizza dough. That's all I know.
I mean, honestly, if there's 14-year-old kids out there that want to get into the business, I don't have a problem with it. I mean, it's not forced labor. It's not like you're forcing kids into labor.
At 14, so what you're saying is that at 14, you're able to make decisions that could alter the course of your life.
Oh, absolutely.
Okay. All right. I just want to get that on
any 14-year-old could do that.
Okay. I want to make sure that
but you teach responsibility at a young age, just like there's people out there teach their kids how to shoot a rifle, right? I mean, of course, that rifle could kill people, but it's very rare because they teach them responsibility, they teach them safety, they teach them the right way to do it. Look, I mean, I don't necessarily think it's a great idea for a 14-year-old to operate heavy machinery, but
the meat grinder, the industrial meat grinder, they should be putting hunks of meat and cramming it down into the meat grinder.
I don't know if it happens exactly the way you're describing it.
Just saying.
So yeah, I mean, look, I don't know. It is. I'd rather see young teenagers willing to work than the young teenagers that just don't want to work at all.
Sure,
And
that age
never
old
enter the workforce, just suck on the teats of society.
Yeah, because those teats are full of milk. Anyway, yeah, it's hopefully these young teenagers live places where there are jobs, because that's not everywhere. But anyway,
I don't know. There's actually millions and millions of jobs right now that are available, and they're really good jobs, and all you need is a high school education. It's just,
and you just have to be able to get to them. That is an important component to this whole thing.
Yeah, true.
You have to be able to get there, and and if you live in extremely poor neighborhoods, you're not likely to be close to those good jobs, my friend.
And they have to stop with the felonies on applications and stuff like that. I think that needs to be completely removed.
Yeah,
because there's millions of people that want jobs, probably, that can't get them, and then we've got millions of jobs sitting open with other people that don't want them. So I think getting rid of that would be a great solution to some of those. And there's good people that have felonies. I mean, who cares if you have a felony, really?
Right. So on that note, Mike, what's your felonious sunshine this week, buddy?
No felonious behavior this week, unfortunately. But I have been.
Well, that's not true. That's not true. I'm sure you probably had some felonious behavior in other states.
Have I had any lately? Well, maybe. Let's just say
maybe.
I've been, as you know, constantly chasing the dream. And I finally found a really good opportunity that I've accepted this week. And I keep mentioning on these shows that I found a new client, a new job, and I help this client, help that client. I've been doing a lot of this independent stuff, business consulting. And I found an opportunity to be the chief of staff for a consulting firm. So it is a lot of responsibility,
Congratulations.
It's a good opportunity. Thank you. I appreciate that. And of course, it's an opportunity to help as many people as possible, which is always the number one objective.
Well, not as many people as possible, only certain people. But that's neither here nor there. We won't get into that. Only certain people. Some people are more important than others. In your world, that's I know your worldview. That's why we're doing this show, because I know your worldview. It is different than mine. That's all right. All right. So I guess you're not going to ask me about my sunshine. So
I was just going to say, I thought you were saying something else. I thought you had another.
I was going to move on. I was going to move on, and then I thought, oh man,
I thought you were so intrigued that you had some follow-up questions for me.
Well, honestly, I normally would be if it wasn't so late already recording this. If we weren't 2 hours behind schedule, essentially starting.
No because you had that. No one knows that but us.
They know it. They know it now. So since it's so late, I thought, no, I'll try and pick up the pace and not just keep shooting the shit.
We still can't skip over you because you are the sunshine. So what is your sunshine?
I am Mr. Sunshine.
Mr. Sunshine.
Well, under normal, I actually had some sunshine, but instead of sharing that, I'm going to just say that my sunshine this week is going to belong to my wonderful spouse, who just accepted a new position at really a good position at her job. She is leaving her department and moving to another department. And it's really good, and they're I was lucky enough to be on the other side of the closed door while she was working from home, and heard the person that she's going to be working for, like, just absolutely giddy when she said she was accepting the position. So I know she's moving into a great spot where she's going to be appreciated, or at least for now. You know how these things go sometimes, but for now, you know, it's all sunshine and roses. And the reason that's my sunshine is because happy wife, happy life.
Happy life. You got it, brother. And that is awesome. Congratulations.
Yeah. Okay. So one of the reasons, Mike, that I wanted to do this story was that it looked at some of the processes of change brought about by the wholesale adoption of a new form of technology, right? Something that altered the way people exist in and relate to the world. And I think we can relate to that with social media and just tech generally today. Also, I wanted to think about clocks. So the question I have is, I guess, like, what is the purpose of a watch or a clock? Like, again, I know what it is now, but just sort of at the like, what is the reason for creating mechanical time? What is the purpose of being able to monitor mechanical time, would you say?
To make sure that you're on schedule and you make your appointments.
When you're first introducing these, that's not how anything works, right? So, like, I mean, you're not wrong, but you're also not right. Do you understand? Like, when nobody else has a clock, like, what is the point of introducing this into a society?
As a business owner, I'd be thinking, like, I would look at any kind of invention or kind of new technology. I would think, well, how is this going to benefit me? And I would think immediately, well, I can keep all my guys on a schedule, and I could tell people be there or meet me at such and such a clock tomorrow, you know, or Thursday or what have you, and it also can correlate to, you know, how much time or labor has been spent on a specific project.
So control.
It's measurable.
So control.
Yeah.
So you're talking about,
yes. If you can't measure it, you can't manage
you're talking
it.
about, so what you're describing is
a good saying that
dictatorial control, my friend. So I would say that in the abstract, similar. They exist to kind of give precision and temporal meaning to events over which people have no control or like no mastery, right? So it's a way to like to exert some sort of control over those things which we have no actual control over, right? They represent kind of humanity's imagined control over the natural world. I mean, you're talking at the micro level, talking about controlling labor. And I'm saying, yeah, that's true. Mm-hmm. But also the clock gives people the sense that they have some sort of control over the natural world.
Well, plus you got to know how old you are, right?
Not really, but I mean, not really.
I mean, at some
point
you
could also know that different. There are different ways of knowing that.
Right. I guess the original, when I'm thinking, like, if you want to think way the hell back to why people originally thought about time, would be to measure the year, the trip around the sun.
I'm not talking about time. I'm talking about mechanical time.
Oh, you're talking about specifically time pieces.
Mechanical, yes, pieces. To mechanize the process.
I got
Why
you.
do you by mechanizing? Like you said, it's so you can more precisely control your labor. You know what I mean? You can more precisely know.
Yes.
Right.
And you can precisely know what time it is during the day or whatever. So I guess what they used to do is look at the sun and say, hey, it's noon. It's noon. It's the high noon. The sun is
We're going to get into all that. But yeah, use the sun, use the stars, use the moon, all that stuff. So here's the thing. Right. I would argue, at least to some degree, that like this idea that humanity because, you know, human beings, we imagine that we control the world. In fact, most of us kind of believe that we exist in some ways outside of the world as masters of it, as opposed to being part of the natural world. It's one of the great sort of, sort of problems I think that we're facing today. It's one of the fundamental issues that we have is this idea that like we view ourselves as not part of the natural world. And you do it, we all do it. Like we manipulate the world to our whims as opposed to existing within it. And as you see from like the earthquake in Turkey and Syria, you go, okay, well we don't really have mastery over the world. You know what I mean? Like that's not a thing that we actually have. Anyway, people have become convinced that through like science and technology, humans can kind of solve the problem of unpredictable nature this idea that we can sort of exist in some ways outside of nature as opposed to within it. So that was one of the reasons, that was one of the motivations for this episode. Finally, I kind of wanted to explore one way that people surrendered their freedom to a new technology, right? Because I think a lot of people have surrendered their freedom to social media. They've surrendered their freedom to tech in general. And
absolutely.
And I think most people don't think about freedom very much. So I wanted to kind of look at this earlier time where people did the same sort of thing. They surrendered their freedom to technology and how some people resisted surrendering their freedom. So maybe this can get people to think about what like the meaning of freedom, which is a word we love in this country, but I don't think very many of us actually think about. We have really limited views of what the word means. When you ask people, I used to do this in class sometimes, I would say, to ask my students, like, what does freedom mean? And the answers are always so silly. They're always just like, well, I don't have to go to this store. I can go to a different store. Or I don't have to go to this school. I can go to a different school. Or like, I can wear what I want, or I can vote for who I want to. You know what I mean? There are all these like very like consumption-based answers. But at a more philosophical level, it's just like, well, none of that really matters much. That's not really freedom. You're still dependent on somebody else making the clothes, somebody else delivering the clothes, somebody else opening a store that sells you the clothes. Like, you know what I mean? Like your freedom is limited by all of those steps along the way. Even if those are minor limitations to your freedom, they are limitations nonetheless. You know what I mean? And I don't think people really think about that kind of stuff. And I mean, and I'm not saying you should be thinking about every single thing, but I do think it's worth contemplating what freedom means. And so that's why I want to do this story. Or as the great Buddhist Zen master Junmen Wenyan once taught.
Exactly.
And I love this. Once taught, quote, "The world is vast and wide. Why do you put your robes on at the sound of a bell?" End quote. I like it. I like it a lot.
Interesting.
Yeah. Like, again, I mean, this is a question. He's asking a basic question of freedom. Okay. So, Mike, in our last episode, we looked at how the conservative, oligarchic antebellum South sought to kind of embrace the modernity of clock time, and in the process annihilated space and distance, right? They adopted a kind of subservience to the clock. We looked at how older generations of Southerners expressed concerns about the loss of independence and the tyranny of the clock. And we explored artist perspectives, specifically through Edgar Allan Poe, who reflected kind of clock time anxieties. If you recall, when we talked about one story where a person has their head, lopped off by the minute hand of a clock. And what was the other story? Oh, and the other story where the devil goes into the Belfry and creates 13th o'clock and sends the whole town into a complete chaotic panic. My favorite thing about that story, by the way, is that when he creates 13th o'clock, the first response people have, the response of the children, of the boys, as the story says, is to say, "Oh my God, I'm so hungry. I have had nothing to eat this whole last hour. Like, I'm supposed to eat at noon and it's 13 o'clock. Like, I've been a whole extra hour without food." And that's my favorite part, is like that I mean, again, it's kind of a satire, but like the whole point is, people were so dependent on the clock that they were like, it wasn't that they were hungry when they were hungry. They knew they ate at noon. And when they found out it was 13 o'clock, they were like, "Oh my God, I've gone a whole extra hour."
That really reminds me of me right now, because I'm on a new fasting diet where I don't eat until 2. And let me tell you something. I'm watching that clock for 2. It's not even been a week, so I'm getting those hunger pains.
Yeah,
and
intermittent fasting.
It's but I feel like $1 million.
Except for at 150,
really
when you feel like a dime.
Well, it's going away after a week. They say it should go away. It's been about a week, and I don't get nearly as hungry, but I'm still a little hungry. That's probably because I was stuffing my face all day long, and now I've completely went cold turkey with
Sure.
that. So cut it off at 8. So I'm done at 8 at night. Don't eat until 2 the next
Okay.
day. Feel like $1 million. Highly recommend it. Anyway, on with the story.
On with the story. So we again, just sort of to bring us to where we are.
So the clock is essential to the fasting method. Just to let you know. Just to let you know, the clock is essential to the
clock
fasting method.
is a pernicious tyrant.
Essential.
Okay. So we left off exploring ways that planners tried to impose clock discipline. A few of those ways. We're going to talk about some more today. But they still wanted to adhere, or they still had to adhere to the cyclical natural time that agricultural work kind of demands, right? So today, we're going to look closer at those attempts and hear more from some of the Black voices to explain their perspectives. And then we're going to look at the New South, or the post-bellum South, right after the Civil War, and the forms of time consciousness that emerged from the ashes of war. So are you ready?
Yeah, man.
All right.
Do it.
All right.
I love ashes of war.
That's nobody loves ashes of war.
I love the other ashes. Sorry, smoking too much.
Yeah. All right, let's do some history. So I'm going to start in a place that you like. The ancient Greeks.
Oh, I thought you were talking about the Turkish bathhouses.
Yeah, okay. Well, a place that is near and dear to your soul. How about that?
Yes.
The ancient Greeks.
Love them.
The ancient Greeks had some ideas about time that seem relevant to what we're going to talk about. Now,
okay, cool.
Their view of time was embodied in two gods, Eon or Aeon and Chronos. Now, Chronos, which is where, of course, you mean it's the word we know.
Chronicle time. That's Mr. Chronicle time, right?
Yes, absolutely. Chronos is, father time. It's where we get the word chronograph or chronograph for a watch, right? A fancy watch is a chronograph, right? It didn't used to be. It just used to be the word for a watch, but now it's a chronograph if it's fancy. But Chronos represented linear time, right? The causal relationship between past, present, and future. The way that we kind of live today in our postmodern world. Time perceived like along a timeline.
Correct.
Now, Aeon is symbolized as a circle where time is interrelated and perpetual. The past, the present, and future are all perceived simultaneously, mysterious and sublime. Now, the Greeks held both of those in their mind. But we might imagine Aeon, because it's hard for us to wrap our brain around Aeon. But we might imagine Aeon, and I'm sure you haven't seen this show, but I don't care. We might imagine Aeon like the Cylon mantra from Battlestar Galactica, which was, quote, all of this has happened before and will happen again, end quote.
All of this has happened before.
But the question remains, does all of this have to happen again?
I did watch that show when I was a kid.
Oh, the old one. Yeah, the old one.
Battlestar Galactica.
The new one is the new one's outstanding. Probably the one of the best examinations of how societies degrade as a result of war that I've seen. I mean, to me, the lesson I tell, or the subtext of that story is all about how societies really degrade as a result of war. I mean, you have how quickly the president of the colonies turns to authorizing or contemplating genocide and immediately authorizing torture and going back on her word and sending the tortured victim out the airlock to die in space, things like that, where you're just the morale, how morality fundamentally degrades because of war. A thing that we can see as in our own country, especially in the post 9/11 world, that as a result of those wars, we've seen a kind of moral degradation where where the ends justify the means in a way that they didn't before. Anyway, it's this idea, this Aeon version of time is this idea that there's a kind of, in some ways, an inevitability, or that time, it's all happened before, it's all going to happen again. It doesn't mean it's going to happen the same way again, but just that these things there's an inevitability to the cycle of time, just like the cycle of seasons.
History will repeat itself.
Yeah, well, yeah, but history will repeat itself, but it'll be wearing different clothes. You know what I mean? So we won't recognize it. So we're going to, and just like before, when it repeated itself last time, we didn't recognize it. And some people will, but most people won't. You know what I mean? Like as a whole, we won't recognize it. So, okay, there's this sort of idea.
Yes. Everything has always already happened at some point in history.
Yes. So this kind of perception of time was the kind of time perception that led many indigenous, like Native Americans, to go into like the lean months of winter, sometimes only eating once or twice a week, half starved. They did this year after year after year, rather than storing more. Now, when European colonists come over, they're like, these people are stupid. They don't understand. But for the indigenous people, they're like, no, we know we could store more, but like the idea of trading the grand communal feasts that they had in summer and in the fall harvest in exchange for food security later on wasn't worth it. It was a trade they weren't willing to make. And also, this has all happened before, and it's fine. You know what I mean? Just a fundamentally different way of viewing time between, having a present view of time versus kind of a future oriented view of time, right? Like, does that make sense?
Now, I don't want to shake things up, but I've been I not only think of that, but I also think of multiple universes and how time is on each one of these. So that's a crazy wormhole that we don't want to go down, but it's crazy. But I believe that's actually out there.
Yeah, I mean, I do too. I believe in the multiverse kind of theory. I buy that. Yeah.
So that's maybe for another show.
And I mean, that's all just wild speculative stuff. But like, the thing is, the point I'm trying to make here is that I'm not making any sort of value judgment about one version of time consciousness over another. I'm saying that there exist and have existed in human beings these various ways of perceiving time. That the linear version of time that we perceive in the West is not universal. It was a choice, and other cultures, other groups, whatever. And science fiction always does a good job of exploring like questions of the human experience. I mean, they just do, because they have the freedom kind of to invent an alien race that does a thing. You know what I mean? So you can really explore something without necessarily having to get into the kind of ugliness of say international relations or war or whatever, in the same way. It's one thing when you watch a show go to war with an alien race or a robot race or whatever, rather than watching something that is just like, oh wow, we're watching the Syrian civil war play out. That's no good. That gives me bad emotions. I don't want to watch that. Anyway, so that's why I bring up the sci-fi, because I think they do a really especially good job of this sort of thing. Okay. I just want you to understand that these distinctions are important. The distinctions in the way that people view time are important, because they are fundamental, core to one's existence, right? I mean, you think about Chronos and Eon, the Greeks being able to sort of hold both of these in their mind at the same time. That's a critical thing for the people who perceive time in the way of Eon, past, present, future, all at the same time, this presentist idea of time. It is completely sort of incompatible with the linear futurist model that we operate on under clock time. Right? Okay. All right. So we're going to come back to that, but I just want to, I'm laying that groundwork because that's important, and it's confusing. All right. As we mentioned last time, planners use bells or horns to announce the beginning of the workday, breakfast and dinner, and for nightly curfew. They use bells or horns for all these things. Planners obviously believe that slaves understood sound-regulated time. One planner had 9 a.m. inspections on Sunday morning and wrote that every slave, quote, distinctly understands that at this hour he will be reviewed. An hour or so previous to the review, I make it the business of the driver to sound the horn, end quote. A Mississippi traveler similarly wrote, quote, at a certain signal upon the cookhouse bell, the young gang came up in fine order to the yard for their dinner, end quote. Another planter named Phoebe was so proud of his own management system that he published it in Southern Cultivator magazine. He explained, quote, "The fundamental principles upon which the system is based are simply these, that all living on the plantation are members of the same family." Sounds like modern corporate speak, right? We're a family here. You're not employees. Phoebe, of course, was the patriarch, not the tyrant, as he said. He insisted that his orders must be obeyed and that, quote, plantation Negroes are much more ignorant than people suppose. They require a guardian. They will work to no advantage. They will do nothing properly unless directed, end quote. He depended on the clock to regulate enslaved people. He regulated, quote, people's hours of rest. The bugle sounds at 9 o'clock p.m. and every servant is required to return to his own cabin. At noon, they rest and take their dinners. The time allowed is from 1 to 2.5 hours during the long hot days of summer. So it was like 1 hour in winter, 2 to 2.5, depending on how hot it was in summer. If the crop will admit it, they should rest 2.5 hours, end quote. In other words, Phoebe's idea of a family sounded more like a kind of authoritarian dictatorship. Other than Phoebe, one's time most certainly was not their own. What did you say?
No, I was agreeing with you.
Yeah.
I said, yeah.
Good, nice, fun family.
But listen, I think what you see here is as far back as the year we're speaking about, leadership, management, whatever you want to call them, has been challenged with trying to build good culture.
I'm not sure what kind of culture you can build on a plantation.
Well, this guy's trying to call it a culture, and he's trying to, he's trying to pitch it to them and kind of make it appear as though, it's a big family. Like, oops, there's a visitor in the background. I see a visitor back there.
Hey, baby. Good night, Todd.
Good night.
All right. Bye-bye.
So, like I was saying, he's trying to build it and make it look like a big family, and he's trying to almost build a culture to create more work or more efficient work or whatever he's trying to create. But I could see it. It's just amazing to me. It just kind of resonated with what I see today.
Sure. I absolutely. He's trying to dictate those terms. Like, of course, that's what a dictator does. Dictate.
He's doing it incorrectly. And you see,
people
today make.
Is there a correct way to run a plantation?
Well, you can't. I'm not talking about the plantation.
Because that's what we are talking about. We're talking about a plantation.
I mean, there is a correct way. They still exist today. There's a correct way to run one. But with this is, he's trying to dictate the terms to them. He's trying to force them to believe in something that isn't real, as opposed to creating an environment that is real and having them, then believe in it, which is more the proper way to, and kind of do it in unison with them, not at them or, forcing it on them.
Yeah. I mean, I hear you. A lot of this falls apart as soon as we realize we're talking about a Southern plantation.
Sure.
I hear what you're saying.
Looking at the business
I know you are.
Yeah.
I know you are. But all business is not the same and has not always been the same, and that's the thing here.
Correct.
Okay. Correct. All right. So, all right. I would love to dig into this, but that'll just take us down for an hour. So I'm going to just So what we can learn from Phoebe and others, of course, is that planners sought to define work by the clock. But the question is, or a question is, what about leisure time? So first off, leisure time that is regulated by the clock ain't exactly leisure.
But here's this is immediately what I thought of. they can then use that as incentive then. Earned time, meaning you must work and do XYZ to earn an hour of sitting outside of the sun or whatever the hell it is that you're doing, right? And because in these the clock as we're talking about was to the plantation owner then and I guess to the business owners that followed just legitimately another business invention, kind of like the when if you're going up to a wood company or whatever, and you've got their guys out in the field chopping down trees, and they're chopping, and they're the best in the country, the most efficient. And then you bring them, you sit down with the owner, and you say, "Listen, I want to make your entire squad way more efficient." He's like, "Nope, we have the sharpest axes around. We have the most the strongest handles around. We have the strongest men around. They're out there, they're humping it all day long. We chop down more trees than anybody." And then you go, "Let me introduce you to a chainsaw," and you sit a chainsaw on the table. That type of invention is like what the clock did. It revolutionized business in general because it made everything more efficient. It gave them that what they lacked, because otherwise it's like herding cats. If you can't have a measurable and say, okay, we have to have X, Y, D, Z done by this time, or you punch in at this time and you leave at this time, it's
I understand
organized,
all that.
it's systematic, it's
Sure.
process driven, and
However,
it adds structure.
Just to counterpoint,
so
everything you're saying is all for the benefit of one person to the exploitation of everyone else.
In this case, correct.
No, in every
case,
case. In every case. I mean, even in the case of the chainsaw, even in the case of the chainsaw, you're talking about, well, now we have a chainsaw, so we can get rid of half of our labor force because we don't have enough trees.
No. Oh, come on. There's plenty of trees.
Yes.
There's plenty of trees, my friend. They just kept no owner would do that. What they would do is they would keep their labor force, and they would work and then have that much more revenue because they would have that much more product. They would expand. They would expand operations.
And then buy up other companies until eventually.
Yes.
But that's the thing. Eventually,
that's the cancer of capitalism, is that the big guys buy up all the little guys.
The cancer of capitalism is that yes, it will destroy everything.
Although I will say, the little guys that get bought up aren't complaining. Like, that's kind of their goal, especially
because the guys that get bought up. Now you say the little guys that get bought up aren't complaining because you're talking about the ownership class. You're not talking about the 20 employees, 18 of whom lose their job because they're no longer needed. You're talking about the guy who owns the place who gets bought out.
Correct.
Not the casualties of war, as it were. Not the what do they call it? Collateral damage. So anyway, all right. I just want to point out your point. You are taking the perspective only of the ownership class, not the majority of the people within the whole system, not the labor. You are, as always, siding with management over labor.
As far as labor is concerned, it is an accurate way to track work so that you're paid accurately, and so that you can also, have that for purposes of, taxes, health benefits, whatnot. That's down the road. But if I was a worker, I'd want to, at the end of my work week, want to know, why are you paying me this much? I worked, this, and I did all that. This is just a way to, again, on both sides, to say this is an even deal.
But only after you accept the logic of the clock. But we're going to get to all that. But real quick, since you've broken all this up, I just want to say tonight's episode is sponsored by Gainesville's own First Magnitude Brewery Ursa American IPA. There it is.
Ooh. And also
delightful.
Grassroots. This is one of my favorite growers, Grassroots. I guess they're a grower company. And this is an indica garlic cookies. one of my favorite, garlic cookies.
Indeed.
For anyone listening out there, if you're ever in a dispensary and you want a good strain, anything with the name cookies is usually pretty good.
Okay.
This happens to be a combination of garlic, I think garlic butter and something else and another strain. So it's garlic cookies, two really good strains put together.
Okay.
Very, very good. Oh, very, very, very delicious smelling. Ooh.
Excellent.
Flavorful. Very, very flavorful.
All right.
Goes great with your morning coffee. Goes great with your dinner, no matter if it's fish or meat or steak or chicken. Very delicious. Delicious.
Okay.
And a very flavorful aroma. Very, very flavorful.
Excellent.
All right. Enough with our sponsors.
So back to the story. I just want to say, so leisure time regulated by the clock is not exactly leisure, right? It's just the end of work. It's not exactly leisure when the boss is clocking your off time. So,
are you speaking of break time?
No.
Or are you speaking? What are you saying when you say leisure time?
Time that you're not working. Time that you're not working.
Something. Time you're not working. When you're off.
You're off time. So, for example, in 1845, the Cornhill plantation in Sumter, South Carolina ruled, and when I say ruled, they had like a book of rules. Quote, the horn must be blown in winter at 8 and summer at 9, after which no slave must be seen out of his house, end quote. Another plantation required slaves, quote, to disperse at 9 o'clock at night, end quote. After mandatory prayer meetings, they had to disperse at 9 o'clock at night after mandatory prayer meetings, end quote. Sorry, I got a mark in there for some reason. Georgia planter, SHC, summed up planters' desires in the magazine Southern Cultivator. So again, sometimes I don't always have names. It's just like they just like write in a letter or whatever, and they at the end it just says SHC. Okay, so this Georgia planter SHC summed up planters' desires in Southern Cultivator magazine. Quote, permit me to inquire whether or not there is such a thing as a plantation clock. It often happens on a plantation that the overseer or driver is not at his post just at the proper time in the morning to start all hands promptly, thereby causing confusion and disorder rarely restored during the rest of the day. Now, what I want is an alarm clock of sufficient size and capacity to ring or put in motion a 50 or 60-pound bell, so arranged as to alarm at any hour desired. If there is such a thing in use, where can it be had? If there is nothing of the sort known, who will make one? End quote. The editor suggested a simple alarm clock for the overseer, or a custom plantation clock that could be made in Connecticut for $30 to $40, which is roughly $1,000 to like $1,400 today. But again, you can see this like obsession with time. Like, all right, my overseer oversleeps sometimes. It screws everything up. How do I solve this problem? Right.
Right. It's funny. It's like the early adopters of technology. It's like they're running into these kinks and these issues, and they're like, how do we fix this? How do we fix this?
How do we force everyone to accept this new way of doing things?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Pretty much.
For planners, the clock was an ideal disciplinary and regulatory device, right? Like, obviously, the bosses saw the value. They thought it was economical, and they thought it was fair, and they loved that it was modern. To defend themselves from increasingly aggressive abolitionist polemics, Southern planners extolled the many supposedly leisurely hours that spent in bondage, juxtaposed against the grueling, dangerous hours of hard labor performed by Northern free wage labor. And they used clock time to do it. One master wrote, quote, the Southern slave is not overworked. He goes out when it is light enough to work. At 8 o'clock, he takes his breakfast. At 12 o'clock, his dinner. At 2 o'clock, he goes to work again. And about 9 or 10 o'clock, goes to bed. End quote.
That's because he has a rooster. He keeps a pet rooster. You need a rooster.
They all have a rooster. But again, he's like, this is so much better than working in the factories. Now, industrial labor schedules were not a whole lot different. Here is one factory schedule from the 1830s. Quote, the following were the hours of labor imposed upon the children employed in the factory. So these are just the kids' hours. Work commenced at 6 o'clock. At 9, half an hour for breakfast. At 9:30 till 12, work. Dinner, 1 hour from 1 hour at 12. From 5 till 8, work. Rest, half an hour. From 8:30 till 12, midnight, work. An hour's rest. So the free labor system was hardly free, right? It still is hardly free, especially for the vulnerable.
Is this the original like labor law manual here?
Just the rules of the one factory.
This is nice. This is great.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean,
this was a factory that's working obviously a couple shifts. They work overnight shifts. Is this the same crew that's getting up and working all 24 hours?
Yeah. They're working. They're getting time. They're getting time off. You see, if you listen to the schedule, they get they go dinner for 1 hour from 12 to 1, but then they come back and work till 5. So they have to be there for dinner. Their meal is regulated, but then they come back to work at 5. They work till 8. Then they get a half an hour off. Then they work till midnight. So they start at 6 a.m. They're off at midnight.
And then they sleep from midnight
till they have to be at work at 6 a.m.
Oh God.
But they do get those 3 hours in the afternoon. So, or 4 hours. Sorry. So they get 9 hours off a day. I mean, not to mention meals. I mean, they are still also allowed meals. So, okay. So my point is that free labor wasn't exactly like, we're talking all about slaves and plantation labor. So, but, it's only fair to contrast that with, what labor was like in the North, right? But that said, we're going to get into some of the more specific details. Southern planters wanted to regulate productivity as well, but they wanted to regulate productivity in a very specific way. They wanted to maximize output per hand rather than, say, increasing yield per acre. So there was no real intent. There was no real effort to increase the yield. They just wanted to increase the output per person, right? Mm-hmm. That was just the drive. That was the drive. Now, there were two forms of slave labor, and we're not going to really talk too much about them, but you should know the difference because it really does matter. There was the gang system and the task system, and different plantations employed different systems. The task system was
like a chain gang.
Yeah, like that. I'm going to say the task system was most common in the rice fields of South Carolina and Georgia. Now, I mean, it existed elsewhere, but that's where it was most commonly deployed. And it involved assigning enslaved workers certain tasks each day. And once those tasks were accomplished, a slave could kind of knock off work. Mm-hmm. So this meant that some days might only need 6 to 10 hours of labor, but during the difficult planting and harvesting seasons, slaves could expect to work as many as 20 hours in a day, sometimes even more.
Sure.
I mean, there are reports of enslaved folks working for 2 straight days with breaks, but with no meaningful rest time. You might get 2 hours off here, during if there was some sort of environmental disaster or whatever that screwed up the harvest or screwed up the plant, they could expect to work, their tasks could be day long, multiple day long. But generally speaking, the task system kind of allowed slaves to sort of work at their own pace because then when they finished their task, they were done. So there's a motive, there's an incentive to work fast to get finished, to have some free time. Right.
Still being used today, by the way.
Yeah.
Contractors,
of course.
The same.
Yeah, I mean, this is the task system of labor is kind of the old-fashioned way of doing things. This is the way, for time immemorial, this is the way people did things. The gang system's a little different. We'll get to that in 1 second. Until Low Country planters were able to reduce the task system to clock time, enslaved people opposed it at every turn. They really opposed this idea of implementing the clock because, of course, if you had to work a rigid 10 hours a day, that seems like a pretty bad deal when you know that you can get a lot of days with only 6 hours labor. You know what I mean? So they would fight this tooth and nail. One planter explained, quote, "Slaves thus employed, that is, working by time, it is well known, move much more tardily than when tasked, end quote.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, again, obviously, like if you know you're working, you know what I mean? Like, fine, you're going to do this.
Hence why it's still used today.
Right. I mean, given the choice, obviously the choice is clear.
Mm-hmm.
The gang system was much more common. Gangs of enslaved people would work sun up to sundown, or whatever hours were set by their labor lords. Now, in his substantial quantitative study, this guy, John Olson, argued free-wage laborers in the North worked more clock time hours than the enslaved population of the South per year. So northern factory workers worked more hours. But nevertheless, he calculated and figured that slaves worked more intensively per hour. In fact, he went so far as to calculate that, quote, slaves on plantations using the gang system worked 94% harder each hour than did free men working for wages, end quote.
Sure, so those guys had a guy with a rifle and a horse standing over them.
You had the same thing in the factory a lot of times, but still, I mean, you were beaten if you slacked off at work and stuff like that. So that happened too in factories. Yeah, I mean, I mean, not every factory, just it was but yeah, you could easily be beaten, and you had no real freedom once you got into the factory system. It's where the labor movement exists, or one of the many reasons. Anyway, this efficiency was accomplished in a couple ways. First, while planters might give a half day on some Saturdays, they would also take those days to make up for rain or other weather events. So since enslaved folks usually had to grow their own food on small plots, the burden of this production was shifted to slaves on the worst days, right? So like if it rained one day on a Wednesday, if you worked on a plantation, or if you were on a plantation where you generally only had a half day on Saturdays, if it rained on Wednesday, guess what? Your half day on Saturday is gone. You have to work all day Saturday. And your half day that you used to be able to sort of cultivate your own food is now gone. You have to use that rainy day to work in the rain in order to get your crops dealt with. Otherwise, you're going to go hungry. Yeah.
Yeah, that sucks.
I mean, yeah. So that was one way that planters were able to get more efficiency, though, was like, whereas in the factory, you could work the hours regardless of the rain. On the plantation, those hours got made up on what would have been your free time. They don't make up the hours because it's rainy in the plantation, right? In the factories. The other way they did it was this. He showed that the average winter day, that is daylight, in winter in the South was 10.4 hours. The spring was about 13 hours, and summer was about 14 hours. Planters typically gave a 1-hour dinner break in winter and a 2-hour dinner break in spring and summer. Now, while it seems a bit paradoxical to the intensity of the hours, right, it's actually pretty scientifically sound. In the winter, each enslaved worker worked 9.4 hours, right? You got 10.4 hours of daylight. You take an hour for dinner. But in spring and summer, when more labor was needed, right, in agricultural work, even with that 2-hour break, you got a longer break, but they still ended up then working 11 or 12 hours in summer. Whereas again, your hours never really changed in the factories. They were whatever they were, winter, spring, summer. But like when labor was most intense, enslaved folks worked more, right? Do you understand?
Sure.
So, yeah.
Sure.
So, and more importantly, they had longer breaks to recuperate because they were working in the hot summer sun, which allowed them to be more productive. So you give that 2-hour break, they come back more refreshed than your factory workers who are exhausted.
And I'm sure that was worked in because at first they had 0 break and they were probably falling down and passing out, and they were figuring we're working them to death. We have to give them some sort of break.
No, because enslaved people were always really expensive. So you would be, like people would certainly beat them and they would kill them for certain reasons, but like generally you don't want to work them necessarily to death. Like indentured servants early on would be worked to death because you'd work them hard. You get a 7-year indenture, 7-year contract. You work them hard, but then after 7 years, you owe them a parcel of land, you owe them clothes, and you owe them tools once they've worked their whole indenture. And so you owe them this, you as the planter owe them this debt as they got close to that 7 years, if they had completed it, as they were contracted, you're much more inclined to try and just work them to death because then you don't have to pay.
How much? I never even saw this or read this anywhere, but do they know how much were slaves sold for or bought for? What did they cost?
Yeah, I mean, it's different places, different times, different enslaved folks have different prices. We could do that some other time. I don't have that information at my fingertips, but yeah, I mean, it was so there's a whole thing where in the 17th century, in the 1600s, there's a great fire in London, and the great fire in London drives the price of indentured servants way up because now people in London and Ireland, in England and Ireland or whatever, are able to work to rebuild London and not have to leave, and wages go up because there's this huge demand for labor. And again, it's a slightly different system, but still, there are advantages to staying in London. And that drives the price of indentured servants up because, like, to recruit somebody to the Americas where, people are dying all the time from diseases over here and everything else, it's like, well, when there didn't seem to be very many opportunities, it was like, well, I'm willing to roll the dice. When wages go up in London, there's lots of jobs to be had because of this huge fire that kills thousands of people and destroys the whole city. There's lots of jobs. There's lots of opportunity. Nobody wants to leave. So that really drives a huge shift in from indentured servants to slave labor in the colonies. There's always kind of a bit of a mix of both up until the Great Fire of London, and then it becomes sort of enslaved labor. But indentured servants are still used. It's basically debt peonage. You have debts that you can't pay, and then you end up selling your labor for a number of years to pay off the debt. But yeah, no, but you don't want to necessarily work slaves to death. I mean, there are some psychopaths, but as a general rule, severe punishments and all that stuff, people will recover from and come back to work. And there's a social value in making an example of one person here or there, to keep everyone else in line out of terror. So we will one of these days we're going to look at a plantation in Jamaica really, really closely and see sort of how this operates on a nuts and bolts level. I've got a really good story I want to tell at some point about that very thing. Yeah. Anyway,
hopefully it has some slave pirates too.
Not in this case, but yeah, it's anyway, but no. Anyway, so okay. Anyway, so what I'm saying about so they had long breaks, they were more productive. In other words, as Olson said, quote, the apparently long breaks for meals and rest, especially during the summer, ought not be attributed to the philanthropic interests of the planners, right? They were the conditions that were necessary for achieving a desired level of intensity. The intense pace of work required rest not only for the slaves, but also for the draft animals. So, end quote. So in other words, the planners saw really little distinction between the animal and human capital. They knew that the animals needed to rest for a longer period of time in the summer. So they also knew that slaves needed to rest. So there's, they kind of see them as the same.
Sure. Yep.
Right. So labor intensity was not achieved just by the clock, but from the marriage of the clock and the whip. And that southern labor was more productive than the northern counterparts shows the greater effectiveness of the clock and whip over the clock and wage docking of the north. Planners were well aware of slaves' efficiency as well. Georgia planner James Thomas gave his bondspeople a 5-minute break after every 30 minutes of labor, with the whip, of course, lurking behind him for anyone who dared to resume work late. He found the productivity increased by 15%. As a result of giving this 5-minute break for every half hour worked. Other planners forced one slave to cook dinner for all the others. If every slave spent 1 hour cooking and 1 hour at rest, that was less productive than having all but one of them rest for the full 2 hours. So they would, recruit 1 or 2 or 3 slaves to do all the cooking for everyone, rather than having everybody go back and make, because normally, for a lot of plantations, everyone would go back and make their dinner. Yep. So you'd have 2 hours off or even 1 hour off, you spend 30 minutes cooking, 1 hour cooking, because, mostly we're just talking about making things like cornmeal mush and things like that, but it just takes a long time to boil them down to make them edible. Grains are hard.
Mm-hmm.
Cereal grains are hard. Anyway, some planners simply use their watches to make weird observations. So if there's this Mississippi planner, M.W. Phillips, who said, quote, slaves cannot or will not, they do not eat in as short a time as whites. I can and do eat my meals in from 10 to 15 minutes. They will eat 30 by the watch, and oftentimes 45. I have timed them and know it to be a fact.
Yep,
So
very true.
They're using their watches
I scarf down my meals, man.
Well,
5
but
minutes. That's all I need. Boom, 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 boom.
I mean,
boom, done.
I think
Down
it's
to
interesting.
business.
He's making that observation, and he's basically blaming it on race as opposed to these people have been working their asses off. And so, they're taking their time with their meal.
You know what'll happen. As soon as they're done, they'll be like, oh, you're done? All right, get back out there.
Well, and that's the thing. Of course you're going to take as much time as possible.
You're done. Get back out there, buddy.
Even pregnant women were mastered by the clock. South Carolina planner Andrew Flynn wrote, quote, pregnant women and sucklers must be treated with great tenderness, worked near home and lightly. Pregnant women should not plow or lift, but must be kept at moderate work until the last hour. Or end quote. The last hour meaning 8 or 9 p.m., depending on the season. So, even if you were pregnant, you had to work the full day, just, at moderate work.
Yeah, it's not too shabby considering they were smoking up until about 30 years ago.
Yeah, not so much then, though, because you didn't have lighters. So smoking required an open fire.
I mean, just the overall, concept of pregnant women shouldn't do certain things.
Yeah. I mean, sure. But it's more just it's more the idea that the clock still sort of dictates their time. Also, quote, the children must be very particularly attended to, for rearing children is not only a duty, but also the most profitable part of the plantation business, end quote.
Yes, sir.
And in case this isn't clear, he's talking about selling children.
I thought he was talking about having the children there so it's more slaves when they grow up for him. And he kind of raises them as little slaves,
You want to maintain your enslaved population. But you also, children are the most profitable to sell. So you want to sell the children. You raise them up right. You make sure they're good and strong by 7, 8, 9 years old, and they've been trained. You've been disciplining them, and you've taught them how to be enslaved. You've broken their will. You've broken their spirit, and then you sell them, and they've got a long work life ahead of them. So he's talking about selling children. That's the most profitable part of the business.
That has to be the most horrendous.
Yeah. It's just inhuman. It's inhuman.
Separating families, and
yep,
they probably raise their children there on the plantation, and as soon as they're old enough, they get yanked from them.
Yeah, you've heard the expression being sold down the river.
Yep.
That's what that's from. Yep.
No way, I didn't know that.
Yep.
Oh my God.
It comes from being sold down the river to the Mississippi Delta, to the Black Belt, they called it. Not because of the black population. It was called the Black Belt because of the millennia of the Mississippi River flooding and receding.
Yep.
It had left really rich black soil all over the whole, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, even as far as East Texas. This black loamy soil had spilled from the Mississippi all over the region, and it was extremely rich and fertile and black. I mean, it was just black soil, so they called it the Black Belt. Anyway, yeah,
interesting.
I mean, it also, I'm not sure how much double entendre might have been at play there or not. I don't know. I really don't. But as far as I know, it was only called the Black Belt because of the soil. But it fits because it was also, all black majority areas or close to it. Anyway, slaves off time and what they did off work hours were also clock regulated. So even when you were off, you were regulated by the clock. Absolute ownership of time was non-negotiable. All time on the plantation, work and leisure alike, was the master's to bestow to define, and to manipulate. Leisure was dependent. Go ahead.
I was going to say, leisure time on a plantation. What in the world could that possibly consist of?
There is that. But it's always, leisure was dependent not only on the master's whims, but was dictated by the clock. Now, a guy that I know you would really, really like, the father of scientific management. This is the guy who really invented the idea of increasing efficiency. Frederick Taylor. He demonstrated, quote, only those of a brutish nature are mentally sluggish, or who are mentally sluggish, can excel as industrial laborers. It becomes imperative to extend the time discipline of industrial capitalism beyond the walls of the factory to encompass the home and hearth. What was true for labor time, or the workspace, soon came to be true for leisure time, or the domestic space, end quote. Formerly enslaved people confirmed that there was no slave time, only master's time. Georgia's Martha Colquitt recalled the difficulty of raising food. Quote, they, slaves, didn't have no time to work no gardens of their own, end quote. Another former Georgia slave, Million McWhorter, agreed. Quote, no, ma'am, slaves never had no gardens of their own. They never had no time of their own to work no garden, end quote. In Texas, Austin Grant said much the same. Quote, we didn't have no little garden. We never had no time to work no garden. When you could see to work, you was working. When you could see to work, you was working for him, end quote. Enslaved folks that did have gardens knew the time to work it was not their own, but was bestowed as a gift by the patriarch. Laura Thornton's father was allowed to grow a small plot of cotton. Quote, he belonged to his white folks, but he had his house and lot right next to theirs, end quote. Aunt Laura, that's all we know her as, Aunt Laura described the generosity of her master. Quote, he give us plenty of time to weave clothes for us to wear, end quote. South Carolina's Ann Bell said, quote, they give us a half Saturday to do as we like, end quote. Sam Anderson recalled, quote, me first master, I liked him best, as he would give Saturday evenings, end quote. And Hannah Scott confirmed, quote, I heard some white folks treat their slaves good and give them time off, but Master Bat don't, end quote.
I guarantee you there was a wide range, man, of what it was like on different plantations, you know.
Sure.
It was probably like prisons, I imagine.
All bad, some better than others.
So exactly. So if you're like in prison, you might go, oh, they're sending me over to, Lewisburg, and someone else will be like, oh, Lewisburg's great. You'll get like nice, good food over there. You'll get this, you'll get that. They give you ice cream, and then you get to Lewisburg, and then someone else might say, well, shit, they're sending me to ADX, and you're like, oh, fuck. That guy, he gives you 1 hour a week to walk around a square, like a dog kennel. You're going to be treated like an animal over there.
Yeah, you're not going to be treated like a person. Your humanity has been stripped. Yeah,
and I'm sure that kind of spread like wildfire even back then.
Well, of course, especially in the South, where the idea of mastery was so central to the whole system.
I'm wondering, and I don't want to go into another rabbit hole, but I'm wondering, as they started to thinking as more efficiency wise, right? So they got the clock thing going on. They got their workers out there, slaves out there, and they got them going around the clock, as they say, around the clock. And the clock's kind of, the good structure, the systems and all that good stuff. I'm wondering if, as they see that, like they started giving slaves in the summer 2 hours off in the summer as opposed to maybe 1, because they started seeing how their work rate was a much higher with a little bit of rest.
Right. Well, that's what you're talking about. Like the one guy who gave 5 minutes off for every 30 minutes working. I've not really encountered a lot of that, but that is the same sort of idea. Hey, look, the point is they're playing with time. How can they use time to their best advantage? 5 minutes off every half hour work. Again, that's he figured out that makes them 15% more efficient. And he does the math and he's like, well, that's worth doing that. It's worth doing that 5-minute break. Now I haven't dug into that particular planner's, legacy or whatever, but maybe he's giving shorter dinner break. Maybe he's giving, what I mean? Maybe he's giving those small breaks, a bunch of small breaks. I don't know. But yeah, there's a wide variety.
Measurable. It's the ultimate measurable.
Well, if they kept records. Yeah. Yeah.
Sure. So, but like as an owner, like as a, whether it's a plantation owner, business owner, whatever, you're always looking at, time now, right? And you're looking at it going, how can I shorten this process?
Sure. But again,
time.
You are always looking at these questions from the perspective of the one as opposed to the many. I mean, and that's great. There's the lack of balance because I am always thinking of the many. It's just where my mind is. My mind is with the many. Like, what does this mean for the worker? What does this mean for the working class? What does, you know what I mean? And you're like, as a business owner, how could you squeeze a little bit more juice from that lemon? And I am like, the lemon should have some say in how much it's squeezed.
But I'm also thinking to myself that at this point in time, they're probably also thinking we should give better living quarters or food, for example.
No,
that hasn't calculated yet.
Nope. So not even a little.
As horrible as it is to think back, okay, if I was a plantation owner in those times, I would want the healthiest workers.
Yeah,
but I guess back then they didn't know, and really, I don't think health was really and nutrition was very.
But again, here's the I just want to point out, like democracy, you choose the monarchy every time. You're always choosing the monarchy, the absolute ruler. And I am like, no, what about the majority of the people? The majority of the people want to do this other thing. Okay. I'm just saying. I mean, I know that's not the way it was. I'm just saying, like, sure. Nutrition would be great. But you would like impose it upon people as opposed to, people. You'd offer choices. You'd say you could have a Lunchable buffet, or you could have a salad. Here they are. So
let me ask you a question.
Yeah.
Like one guy, like I'm just saying, okay, all of a sudden he rolls out this nice succulent buffet at lunchtime.
Sure.
Because
if there's one thing, hold on. If there's one thing I know, it's that after a really big fatty meal, the thing that I really want to do more than anything else, and what I will be best at, is going out into a hot field,
maybe
and laboring.
Okay, maybe not lunch, dinner time buffet.
Yeah, but dinner's at noon.
Not now. Nah, not anymore.
You're eating your dinner meal at noon. And then going to the field for 9 more hours, or for 7 hours, or whatever.
This is an Italian dinner on a Sunday. We don't eat at noon. All right, not anymore. What we do is so now remember.
So hold on. I just want to hear this. I want to really quick make sure I understand. So what you're saying is some employer is bringing dinner to you, meaning that you're working through dinner.
So
you've been there all day, and now it's dinner time. And your employer is like, hey, look, I know you have to work until, you have to work 14 hours a day, but I'm going to feed you a nice dinner. I'm just to understand where we are.
Wherever the end of the day is in your scenario, I mean, there's got to be an end of the day.
But they don't feed them at the end of the day. You're done.
Listen, in my mind, I'm thinking they're up at the rise of the sun and they work till sunset.
Well, they're up at 4 a.m. as we've learned. Yeah, a lot of time, that's
At sunset, they drag their asses back to their huts in the back, wherever their
cabins, but
are cabins. And let's say there's a big succulent filet mignon waiting for them, with a little note that says "Job well done today." And you don't think, he'd get noticeable returns out of that type of thing, and then that word would spread, and all of a sudden they're thinking, well, maybe we should, but obviously it didn't happen like this. I'm just thinking as a business mind, like,
right.
Maybe because you're thinking, okay, they work more efficiently with a break. How about maybe they'll work more efficiently with better food. Maybe they'll work more efficiently with, better sleeping quarters or what have you. I'm just wondering if that, I guess that
the answer is no.
Because
none of these things occur to anyone. Never.
Shit.
That does not occur.
Dumbasses.
Because but that's also, now you're talking about cutting into profits, and that seems,
true.
That's a toughie, buddy. That's a toughie. But what I do want to say is, we just read these couple of quotes from some former enslaved folks, and I want to point out. Well, no, we just read them. We just read them.
The ones you read. You did, by the way, a magnificent slave voice. I loved it. It was
did I do a voice?
Yeah, you did a voice.
I don't think I did. I think it's just so okay. So
it's almost like Morgan.
Okay, I got to make two. I got to make a side note, and then
Morgan Freeman came in and started to take over. Go ahead. It was good. I liked it.
Right. So listen, a lot of these interviews that were done with ex-slaves were done by perhaps well-meaning, but also kind of racist in their time white folks who. If you read a lot of these slave interviews, they wrote things down as if they wrote the interviews down like phonetically, but they did so in a way where they would write like their questions in proper English, and then and some of we know some of these interviewers were like Southern, we're like from deep South, and we're like, we know you have a Southern accent, but they wrote their questions down in proper English. And then when the slave answered them, they would say, like, instead of they would always write DE, like day. They would sort of make these like slang abbreviations, these vernacular, phonetic abbreviations. And there's actually been a long debate among historians about like how we should use these slave interviews now. Should we quote them as they were written down, which reflects a certain accent and reflects a certain kind of sensibility of the interviewer, rather than, it's like, because, if you're talking to, I talk to people from the South. I live in the South. I talk to people with really thick accents who are like, oh, man, they go over there and they go, and they go fishing and they go hunting. And it's like, sure, they're saying they go hunting, they go fishing, they go over there.
Yeah.
But I would never, if I were interviewing them, I would write THEY, they go over THERE. I would, because I know what they're saying. It's an accent. But because there's a kind of inherent racism to some of these interviewers, they're like, oh, you're uneducated. So they write it down. DEY, day, go over DER, dare. And a lot of the interviews are written that way. Again, like I said, sometimes the interviewers are Southern and they have a Southern accent, but they write their own questions out proper. And so, okay. Sure. But when it's black interviewers interviewing former slaves, they don't tend to do that. They tend to write everything sort of, like the same way they write their own questions, right? Whatever, there might be certain slang words or certain kind of vernacular phrases or whatever that they write down because they are, uniquely regional or whatever. But as a general rule, they just write them down the same way you or I would today. So as I quoted some of these, I usually translate the words to the words that they are properly, so that I don't accidentally read them in some sort of, because I don't want to read them in a way that is like disrespectful. Mm-hmm. However, I do leave the grammar and the syntax the same. So like the last quote that I read said, I heard some white folks treat they slaves good and give them time off, but Master Bat don't. I'm not going to put words in that person's mouth, because that's what they said. How they said it might have been, how it was written down might have been, I heard some white folks treat day slaves good, but I didn't write it as day. I wrote it as they, but the vernacular is still, it's not grammatically correct. So if I had an accent there, that was completely by accident, and it might have just been because the vernacular is off. My point of all this is there is a great difference in the tone of the ex-slave interviews based on whether the interviewer was white or black. And in fact, they've actually done these cross studies because occasionally a white interviewer and a black interviewer would interview the same person sort of accidentally, or, like they get their signals crossed. And so you can compare them side by side and see the difference in the answers to the same questions, which is interesting. So white interviewers frequently recorded small kindnesses and stories like the one we just said a minute ago, Hannah Scott's, about how kind her master was by letting her, or Aunt Laura framing, her being able to make her own clothes as a kindness. Whereas black interviewers often heard a much less varnished account of the story. You know what I mean?
Sure.
And a lot of that had to do with these things were done by the government. And so you had government agents like showing up at the door, or, government workers showing up at the door. And, you're like, for a lot of these people, it was the Great Depression when a lot of these interviews were done. So like a lot of these people are like, they see a white government employee show up at the door and it's in the middle of the Great Depression, and they're not sure if they're somehow working with the relief agency because, they have no food and there's no jobs and it's the Great Depression, for crying out loud. You know what I mean? So it's like, so you don't want to say anything that might offend this white person's sensibilities. So you just watch your P's and Q's and make sure you talk real nice to him or her. You know what I mean?
Yep.
And so, but then when Zora Neale Hurston, shows up at your door, you're like, sister, let me tell you what it was like. You know what I mean? And you get this unvarnished account where it's like, what I'm talking about. We are similar. You can relate to what I'm going to tell you. And I don't feel like I have to hide the truth from you. And again, this is not to say those interviews aren't truthful, but they don't necessarily say warts and all. Sometimes they frame things like again, the way that woman framed being able to make her own clothes as a kindness given by her master kind of tells you a little bit about that person, about that master. Oh yeah, he's so kind. He let us make our own. He gave us plenty of time to make our own clothes. Well, I mean, that's not easy. You know what I mean? That's not easy work. And it would be, he could just as easily buy slave clothes from Brooks Brothers, which is what a lot of them did. I don't know if you know that. That's how Brooks Brothers.
No way.
Yeah.
That's how they got their start.
That's how they got a lot of money.
Oh my goodness. I didn't know that.
Was selling cheap clothing to Southern planters for their enslaved population. Yeah. Yep. Brooks Brothers, rich on slave money. Anyway, but they went bankrupt and sold out to somebody else. So fuck you, Brooks Brothers, and fuck the Brooks Brothers riot that stole an election in 2000.
Oh, really? I didn't know.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. The Brooks Brothers riot, that prevented people from counting ballots in Florida. Cause people were scared because they were being threatened, with their lives. So, they were forced to stop. It was called the Brooks Brothers riot because they were all, everybody that was told to dress real nice, to show up real nice, so that the press would get video of of guys in suits and ties protesting, so they'd look like, real respectable, like
gentlemen,
as they said, I'm going to kill you and your family if you keep counting those votes. But then the press was like, their brains exploded because they were like, well, wait, this guy is dressed in a really nice suit and tie. I'm not going to show the part where he is threatening people's families, because that doesn't fit with my view of people who wear suits and ties. That's what the poors do.
Oh, fellow members of the Roman Senate, hear me. Shall we continue to build palace after palace for the rich? Or shall we aspire to a more noble purpose and build decent housing for the poor? How does the Senate vote? Fuck the poor! Good.
Anyway, back to the story yet again.
The poors.
Yeah, the condescension, man. Southern planters sought to control time in every facet, in work, meals, sleep, even play. The former slave Mark Oliver explained, quote, "We could do whatsoever we pleased, just so long as we got to bed by 9 o'clock," end quote. Isabella Dora detailed, quote, Master Fair let his slaves have dances and frolics on his plantation, and on Saturdays, they danced till 12 o'clock midnight. But Master wouldn't let his slaves dance after 12 o'clock, end quote. Even with children, time was a gift. Nancy Rogers Bean, a former slave, her former mistress gave her a doll, but, quote, she only allowed me 1 hour every day to play with it, end quote. So even her playtime was regulated by the clock. The clock was so prominent that slave children's games featured the ticking tyrant. Madison Bruin of Texas described a game called Chickamaw, Chickamaw, Craney Crow, a game a lot like red light, green light, where, quote, somebody yelled out 1 o'clock or 2 o'clock or any time, then one side tried to catch them on the other side, end quote. He basically describes it where, like, they draw a line in the dirt, and, you know, it's sort of like the red light, green light, you know, where you're, or the other one where you're like, I can't remember. There's like a game real similar where you turn your back and everybody creeps up on you and you're like, you know, I don't know, said, you know, 3 steps and you got to take 3 steps towards them.
Yes.
And, you know, they turn around and see if they can touch anybody or whatever, you know, that game. It sounds like that, except you yell Chickamaw, Chickamaw, Craney Crow, which sounds way more fun. Anyway, all of this was just to reinforce that all time was Master's time. All time governed by the clock.
All time.
The Master's clock. So ironically, many masters resented the clock's tyranny themselves, but they enforced its discipline. In 1846, the planter James Henry Hammond lamented, quote, all for a snug little farm where I could indulge my fondness for the country and for agriculture, end quote. He longed to abandon a society that, quote,
hold on.
depends on having every screw tight and the whole machinery working on clockwork principles, end quote. Yeah.
No, that's a good accent too, but you shouldn't be ashamed to do accents of anybody. And
well, I'm not ashamed to do accents of anybody, but I don't want to force phonetic speech into the mouths of people who may or may not have talked that way. And I also want to avoid the connotations. I gave James Henry Hammond an aristocratic Southern accent, if you notice. Now, I can do that for a Southern planter because they are aristocrats. And in fact, there are a few quotes in here that as I have read over this script, as I've come across them, I can't help but read them in a Southern accent. So I will do that. Every time I read them, I'm like, I in my own head, I'm reading it in a Southern accent. So I know it's going to come out of my mouth that way. So more pointedly, William Eliot complained to his mother in 1857, I cannot fix a time for visiting you. I'm the slave to circumstances, some of them not free from vexation, which does not allow me to call my time my own, end quote. One planter's guest in 1859 found clock obedience even too much to bear. Quote, the terrible punctuality which made slaves of us all and kept me always looking at my watch and always afraid of being late for something, as indeed I was once for dinner, in spite of all my precaution. 4 minutes and a half exactly. Shall I ever forget it? End quote.
Yep, his wife's breaking his balls.
Yeah. The children actually gave him, quote, private warnings as to how soon the prayer bell would ring in the morning. And they furnished me with much valuable secret intelligence as to the enemy's weak points, end quote. You know, Southern plantations sort of operated like, kind of like hotels, as people travel. You know what I mean? So a lot of times a plantation visitor wasn't necessarily known by the planter themselves. They might be known as an acquaintance of an acquaintance or something. And they would stay and pay a little board, you know, room and board and stay as they travel, just so you understand the context. So this guy, this is like the pinnacle of white privilege, right? He's like, I am a slave to circumstances. I was late for dinner once and they won't let me forget it. They keep telling me I was late. I mean, yeah, you're on a plantation looking at literal slaves going like, I can't believe they keep picking on me for being late to dinner. You know, it's woe is me. It's so hard being me. These stop crying out there while you're getting whipped. I'm talking about me. I was late to dinner and they keep picking on me.
I can envision him having just one ball breaking wife and him being lazy and not wanting to show up, being late. Just her, just.
This was a guy visiting. He was a visitor to the plantation. He was just a guest who like showed up late to dinner 4.5 minutes, and then they're just like, they keep busting his balls. Like the plantation owner and mistress or whatever are like busting his balls for showing up late to dinner one time. By 4.5 minutes, which again shows you that even he is like just looking at his clock all the time. He knew he was late by 4.5 minutes.
Yep.
So anxiety over the loss of freedom was legitimate. I mean, this is a legitimate thing people worried about. Time was a cruel master, and failure to serve it often led people into debt. For such people, time showed very little mercy. One writer in 1845 warned that the planter in debt, quote, has chalked out to himself a hard lot and voluntarily enters on a state of servitude worse than Egyptian bondage. His work is never accomplished. He toils at all hours, and yet is never ahead of his work. The present is full of anxiety, care, and hard work, and a dark cloud rests upon the future. Work, 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 from weary chime to weary chime. Work, work, work.
Love it.
As prisoners work for a crime. End quote.
I love it.
By 1860, the tyrannical rule of Father Time in the South was really no different than Yankee time obsession. So we've done all this. Let's look at slave experiences a little bit more deeply. They had to internalize some clock time discipline, but as with other oppressed people, resistance formed, altered, and reformed over time, to meet new challenges. The philosopher Max Horkheimer wrote in 1967, "There remains the hope that in the period of world history which is now beginning, the period of docile masses governed by clocks, some men can still be found to offer resistance." End quote. So let's look and see if we can find such people.
Mm-hmm.
All right, now we're going to jump way ahead. In 1990, the historian Wilson Jeremiah Moses studied African American acculturation, and he concluded that African Americans were, quote, more than an ethnic group, less than a nation, end quote. His study explores how members of distinct African groups had much of their traditional practice stripped away when they, the transatlantic slave trade. And then they had Euro-American culture kind of imposed upon them, which in parts they accepted and in parts they resisted. These experiences were distinct from sort of ethnic European immigrants for a variety of reasons, but not least of which was the declining importance of ethnic politics when African Americans finally achieved physical mobility to move into like the urban centers of the North, but also the absence of strong economic, cultural, and intellectual life across multiple generations of African Americans who had been ground down by institutions that punished those things harshly, right? Nevertheless, a patchwork of African traditions, these mostly blended ideas from multiple ethnicities of groups of people from various places, sort of bringing ideas over, they kind of get blended and passed on generation to generation. So these plus subtle forms of resistance rooted deep among many African Americans. Among the forms of resistance that became intertwined with Black culture was behavior in relation to time. All right, you're going to like this.
Okay.
In his extensive study of urban African Americans in the 1960s, a study called, quote, Time and Cool People, end quote. Anyways, really probably the best titled thing that I read for this whole project. Anyway, Time and Cool People, John Horton found that, quote, in the street, again, this is in the 1960s, in the street, watches have a special and specific meaning. Watches are for pawning, not for telling time. When they are worn, they are decorations and ornaments of status. The street clock is informal, personal, and relaxed. It is not standardized to other clocks. In fact, a street dude may have an almost infinite toleration for individual time schedules. To be on time is often meaningless. To be late, an unconsciously accepted way of life. Quote, or a quote within a quote, I'll catch you later, end quote within a quote, or just later, are the street phrases that mean business will be taken care of, but not necessarily now, end quote. Now, this relates to, I'm going to get a little personal, this story that my mom told me. about when she was a flight attendant. She told me a story about a party with another flight attendant that she attended. That other flight attendant was a black woman. And Mom tells the story that she and my father, like the woman told her what time it started. And my mother being a striving to be middle class, but actually working class white woman. They showed up. The party was at 8. She showed up at 8. And no one was there. They were the only ones. And they were there. They stayed there. A couple of other people that they worked with showed up. All the white people all showed up, between like 8:10. And then, about 10 o'clock, 2 hours in, she was like, okay, well, time to go. Called it a night. And as she was getting ready to leave, she said as she was leaving, that's when all of her coworkers, like black friends, were all showing up, a couple hours after it started. And she said, she was like, it was so weird. Like we were ready to go, there were a handful of people from work, but like, it wasn't like a big, she was like, it was fine, whatever. But like, it wasn't like a rollicking party.
Yeah.
But like, and again, she was like, she's like, I just couldn't believe all these people were showing up 2 hours late.
Yeah. I mean, it's cultural differences big time. I tell you what, when I was living in Florida, I didn't have a car.
Yeah.
Me and my buddy, one of my best friends down there, my best friend down there is a black dude. He used to drive me to work. We worked at the same spot. We were late every single day. So
I'm going to tell you another story. When one time I was in a bar in Jamaica near Port Antonio, which not a huge touristy area. I was there doing a conference and doing research in the mountains. And anyway, but I was near Port Antonio, and it was this very locals kind of part of town. Actually, best, and I know this is a big stereotype. I don't care. Best jerk meat I've ever had in my life. As they were cooking, literally, they had cinder blocks like squared up with like the grates they were using looked like they were just like whatever random ass pieces of iron were still lying around that they could just slap over these cinder blocks, and they were just like cooking over open wood fires. Like it was amazing. Anyway, I'm at this bar, and I wanted another beer, but the proprietor, who introduced himself as the proprietor when I first came in, and served me, he was sitting down on an overturned bucket with his family, sort of in like a little space in the kitchen, which was just off the bar, so you could see. So he's sitting there with his family and I guess like some of the employees or whatever, and they're eating. And so he could kind of see me, and I'm there at the bar, and he's just like, he's like, hey, you tall enough to reach over to get a beer? And I like reached over and I was like, yeah. He's like, go ahead. I'll just add it. I'll add it to your check. Never moved, never got up off the bucket, whatever. He was on his own time schedule, not mine. And it stuck with me because it was like so bizarre, especially because, as a former bartender, as a guy who spent years as a bartender and, server and everything else, it's just like to like walk up to the bar and have the guy like and he looked at me for a while, like, is this guy going to walk away or is he going to stand there? I could tell he's not leaving. Hey, buddy, what do you need? Oh, I was going to get another beer. Can you reach him? Yeah. All right. Just get one. Like, all right. And I mean, he was even like, there's a bottle opener over there. He's like, there's a bottle opener over there. I'm like, all right. I'm like, what do I tip for that? Like, what do I tip for serving myself a beer? The point of all this is that African Americans even still can adjust to white people's time sensibilities, right? Which are generally like future oriented, and punctuality is kind of valued, right? But they also reject these as a kind of resistance to the primacy of clock regulated life. You're like, oh, it's a cultural difference, but those are specific choices. They're resisting this cultural norm among white folks, right? I mean, there's a resistance, and it's rooted in these earlier times. They can resist these institutions by rejecting the tyranny of the clock, adopting a more presentist, naturally defined notion of time instead. Like I was saying, this idea of like, no, the thing that I'm doing in the present is the most important thing. So I'm not going to cut that short because it would be rude. I'm having a good conversation. I'm not going to end it. I'm going to do the thing I'm doing.
Right.
I'll just be late for the next thing because that is not important because the thing I'm doing right now is the most important. This time consciousness is known among sociologists as colored people's time, or CPT. I'm sure you've heard that.
Yes, I have.
Yeah, that's what I thought. I thought you'd like that part. So, so we're going to get to talk about CPT throughout the
CPT.
Thing. Yeah, and again, I mean, I know colored people's time is like a terrible phrase for it, but it is like a sociological term that goes back to when this phenomenon was first sort of studied or whatever. And so I'm going to use the term knowing full well that it's like it's a relic of the past, but it is still like the terminology still sort of holds for the purposes of like academic study or whatever.
Sure.
The strategies of CPT are really similar to the strategies that were deployed by European and white northern, like American laborers who themselves resisted the imposition of clock time on their labor. The fact that the same strategies were deployed suggests that we might understand CPT as a kind of class struggle, or just like this resistance to clock time as class struggle. Now, CPT, of course, has a pejorative kind of connotation. Most people, I shouldn't say most people, most white folks or whatever, dominant cultural, whatever, do not like look at this way of viewing time and think it's great, right? There's a kind of pejorative connotation.
Yes.
But that said, I want to set aside this idea as just a product of a dominant culture's contempt for different values. And we'll look at CPT a little bit throughout the rest of the study, just periodically as a socially constructed repudiation of clock time, right? That it's a resistance that exists because enslaved people refuse to internalize clock time despite all of the master's efforts. Even when their outward behaviors had to be dictated by it, they never internalized it. Right?
Gotcha. Yes.
I mean, again, as evidenced by the fact that CPT exists.
Correct.
Like other 19th century workers, Southern slaves couldn't fully resist the imposition of the clock. In fact, I mean, obviously, the vocabulary, the idea, the legitimacy of modern time conceptions were already accepted by varying degrees by 1865. In fact, Southern African Americans and white middle and working class Americans shared more time sensibilities than African Americans shared with pre-industrial West Africans.
Mm-hmm.
Pre-20th century West African cultures had very little need for precisely measured regular time. There were very few clocks or watches present there. So slaves arriving in the Americas had well-established, task-oriented, natural time consciousness. So you might assume that the New England merchants, who really were the traders, the slave traders, and other merchants in the who went to 19th century West Africa, would have carried their own clock time obsession and tried to proselytize their trade partners, right? I mean, obviously, you think in terms of business all the time. Like, you would imagine that New England merchants arriving in West Africa, you've even said this before, would want things done on a certain time schedule. They would expect things done on a certain time schedule. And so they would have to train their would-be traders with that same time schedule. But like when I told you when we did the Robin Johns episode, that like a slave ship might sit in the harbor for 3 months, a month, 6 months in order to fill up. You were like, I don't, it's business. Yeah. I'm like, no. But this sort of gets at why that was. Well, but this gets at why that was because you're talking about traders who are dealing with people who have a fundamentally different understanding of time.
Yes, correct.
Like a completely different consciousness. And so this kind of goes all the way back to that those Robin Johns episodes and answers your question. Like this is, or rather justifies my answer. This is why it took so long. It took a long time because there's just a different way of viewing the world, viewing time. Anyway, so you would have assumed that New England merchants would have tried to proselytize their partners, but this obviously doesn't seem to be the case. So one merchant, Samuel Swain, complained about his African counterpart in 1810, quote, "He is not remarkable for his punctuality as a merchant." Sorry. I love that quote. "He is not remarkable for his punctuality as a merchant." Like this guy ain't great. Yeah, not remarkable. A merchant John Howland, his attempts to sell watches in West Africa in 1823 was a complete failure. Quote, I sold my rum and trinkets to good advantage on the coast. My watches, I lost one. End quote. Now, when West Africans did buy mechanical timepieces, it was for different reasons than you might expect. Now, I'm going to read you this racist kind of account from 1897 in order to kind of illustrate this, but it's a story of a Connecticut clock manufacturer who learned that there was a rival selling large, cheap clocks, quote, out to the wilds of Africa, end quote. So this Connecticut clockmaker invested heavily to make a better clock and ship them in order to compete in the same market, all of which should sound perfectly reasonable to you, business-brained guy.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So the story goes, he's like, quote, strange to say, sales were very slow, while his rival, turning out a cheaper and far less accurate timepiece, was selling all he could make. Finally, the explanation for this came. Savages like noise. The clocks had a particularly loud and aggressive tick, end quote. Now, again, I mean, this is the savages like noise thing is pretty racist on a number of levels. First off, savages, come on.
Well,
and then,
of course.
Yeah, and then also like they like noise. Well, yeah, maybe they like the noise of the clock, but like there's no but to assign a kind of positive or negative value to that is weird. Like Correct. Everybody like, I mean, different cultures like different things. That's a weird. Yeah, it's weird to be like these weirdos like loud noises. Well, whatever. They like the tick for whatever reason they do. Anyway. All right. West African people had little need for clock time managed existence. Natural time and task orientation, like we talked about, worked just fine. Thank you very much. Like other pre-industrial peoples, West Africans didn't need or want an appreciation of clock time. They were pretty resistant to it. The Kenyan scholar John Mabidi writes, quote, the linear concept of time in Western thought, with an indefinite past, a present, and an infinite future, is practically foreign to African thinking, end quote. Instead, all time, past, present, and future, are compounded into what Mabidi calls no time. Western travelers to the region reported these differences. One missionary reported, quote, the Yoruba worships the objects of nature above him. The moon is one of them, end quote. Speaking of one man, this missionary said, quote, he is a good calculator. He tells his age by the number of moons he has seen, end quote. Ooh. So there you go. You said, can people people should know how old they are? Well, yeah, you count the moons.
He's using the wrong. I mean,
not really.
It depends. Yeah, you're right. But that would be very difficult, I would think, because sometimes it's hard to see them. I don't know. I guess it's nights.
Yeah, but it's how many.
Just count the nights? He's counting the nights.
No, he counts the moons. He counts how many full moons he's seen. So every full moon, he knows he's been around. So he could say, I've seen 350 moons. And then, and then anybody's like, all right, so 350 months. He's been around for 350 months, whatever that is.
I got you.
Again, I mean, there's no logical reason that we calculate time the way we do. We just do it that way. You know what I mean? Like there are myriad ways to do it. I mean, Chinese New Year is the Lunar New Year. Other people celebrate the Lunar New Year. Jewish people celebrate a lunar calendar that is in a constant rotation. You know what I mean? Like there's just different ways to operate. Anyway. And so yeah, that's kind of the point. In 1830, Hugh Crow made a similar observation. Quote, the Bonians compute time by observing the moon, and it is surprising with what accuracy they will calculate the ebbing and flowing of the tides, end quote. So like, I mean, you learn the system you grow up in and you master it. You know what I mean? That's simple as that. Like these guys, I mean, he's writing this down because like these guys understand the tides coming and going at a time where Europeans really were not as good at that, because as they move to calendrical and mechanical time, they weren't as good at calculating the tides because they weren't focused on the moon as much.
That's right.
These guys that grew up thinking only of the moon as a timepiece could calculate the tides pretty accurately. Anyway.
Geniuses.
Yeah. I mean, that's the thing. Everybody is in their own way. Of course, these presentist conceptions of time gave rise to stereotypes of African laziness and eventually CPT. The Scottish explorer Mungo Park, who was, of course, immortalized in the Burna Boy banger Monsters You Made, which is an awesome song, though.
I bet they thought it was cool, probably thought we was fools when we would break all the rules and skip them classes in school, because the teacher them teaching what the white man them teaching, them European teachings in my African school. So fuck the classes in school, fuck Mungo Park and the fool. That's how they found River Niger, they've been lying to you.
Mungo Park observed this, writing, quote, "Loss of time is an object of no great importance in the eyes of the Negro. If he has anything of consequence to perform, it is a matter of indifference to him whether he does it today or tomorrow or a month or two from now. So long as he can spend the present moment with any degree of comfort, he gives himself very little concern about the future," end quote. Now, Mungo Park's ignorance of African time consciousness was essentially repeated over and over and over. Quote, "A Negro has no idea of providing for the future. His thoughts are limited to the present. He never thinks of tomorrow," wrote White Marsh B. Seabrook in 1834. Likewise, someone named H.C. wrote in 1840, "It is a characteristic of the Negro that he lives for today and is willing to let tomorrow provide for itself," end quote. According to H.C., the only way to resolve this problem was, quote, "by proper discipline," end quote. Which, I'm sure we can imagine what he means. Since, quote, "time is a language, and since people from different cultures speak it differently," end quote, conflict between linear, mechanistic, capitalistic, Western time language and the more presentist, task-oriented, natural West African time was inevitable. This conflict was going to happen. And we can observe the conflict among Southern slaves. Before the introduction of clock time, slaves were committed to natural time, as evidence from the 18th century even suggests. A band of Virginia runaways in 1760 told their captors, quote, "They have been 10 moons from home," end quote. A runaway from South Carolina reported, quote, "He has made 2 crops for his master and has been absent from his servant's service 2 moons," end quote. One enslaved man, when he was interrogated about specific details of an insurrectionist plot, said, quote, "The sun was about 1 or 2 hours high," end quote. African natural time conceptions were strong. The domination of mechanical time did not happen suddenly, but was a process of degrees. All right, so we will stop here with these 2 conceptions of time.
Okay, good. I was going to say,
we'll stop here with
your accent faded there.
I wasn't doing an accent on that last one.
Okay, good. Good.
Yeah. Because it would have been an African accent. I can't do that.
Yeah.
Because when we think of African accents, when we think of African accents now, we think of like English accents of African. And that's not fair for 1760s. Like, who knows? So we'll stop there with these 2 conceptions of time in conflict and nearing a crossroads. The end of the Civil War presented an opportunity to reimagine the world. The degree to which time consciousness entered into Black consciousness would prove critical to the path that would be taken then in the South. In Edgar Allan Poe's The Mask of the Red Death, Prince Prospero finds himself at a crossroads as well. With a plague ravaging his town, he chooses to hide from rather than engage with life. He tries to create a perfectly mechanistic and predictable world outside the unpredictability of life in the town. An ebony clock prominently displayed in his abbey serves as the metaphorical mechanistic worldview. But Prospero cannot escape life's unpredictability. The plague finds him in his abbot and strikes him down as he flees it. Prospero dies, literally bowing before the clock, which casts its long shadow over his body, even in death.
He ran out of time.
Will the New South worship and die in the shadow of the clock like Prospero? We will find out in part 4 of The Devil in the Belfry. In the meantime, Mike, how can the people contact us?
They can contact us at unbalancedviews@gmail.com. And you can send us all your recommendations if you'd like to hear a specific story or topic. We will highly consider it. You can also find us wherever you find your favorite podcasts. Apple Podcasts, Podbean, podcast.com, Pod Apple, Pod this, Pod that.
Spotify,
all of them. Share, like, comment,
subscribe,
leave us your messages. And that's it for now.
If you send us an email with a story request, I just want to say one of us is always happy to dig a little deeper. It's me. I'm the one who does that. And maybe, the good story, I could find good information. Maybe it'll be an unbalanced episode. So send your any cool stories, And in the meantime, thanks for listening and goodbye.
Peace.